Hello and welcome to this edition of the Academy. It gives me great pleasure as always to welcome a very dear friend of mine, Mr. David Emsley from Body Mechanics. So Dave, thank you so much as always.
Pleasure.
And really, Dave and I will really go through today one of the more common issues that Dave and I would look to really explore and resolve would be the idea of wrist pain. So wrist pain is unfortunately a very common recurring thread that can display in many players, but certainly what Dave and I typically observe is that often when you get pains with the wrist is really the issue. So as an example being that often the last segment to adapt, good examples being how players kind of move and adjust through impact, is often the first segment to go out. So when we look at wrist pain historically and typically, there's kind of two very evident, very recurring types of pain that we can see. One end transition mainly through the trail wrist, so you'll see with those live 3D values currently being screened and displayed on screen now, that when we start to see excessive amounts of extension with radial deviation, often combined with forearm pronation in transition, that can be a big influence around why some players may experience certainly trail wrist pain, and equally then so through lead wrist, how the lead wrist moves through impact, as we'll explore in a different tutorial. That can then also connect back to the same issue that Dave and I go through today. So once again, using those real-time values on screen, when we start to see excessive amounts of extension alongside radial deviation, which can also connect back to forearm pronation, that can be one of the more common movements we see in golf that can connect back to wrist pain. But what Dave will certainly go through in this tutorial is that often the wrist is simply adapting to imbalances and constraints elsewhere. So for sure, the pain might migrate through the wrist, but the wrist is actually rarely the issue. It's simply adapting for and adjusting for imbalances elsewhere. So Dave, welcome, and very much look forward to kind of hearing your feedback around how, yes, we may see wrist pain, but the wrist invariably is actually often not the problem.
100%. In fact, I'd probably say that 90+% of the wrists that I see, yes, there's inflammation, yes, there's something going on at the wrist, but the reason there's something going on at the wrist is because it's adapting to something that hasn't moved well enough in the rest of the system. So these adaptive patterns that we see of the wrist going into these jeopardizing positions do tend to be from the rest of the system not moving well. So an easy demo for us today, Mark, is I'm going to say, right, you're my player now. So we're going to look at this. I'm going to say, take address position for me. So we're looking at the arm connection through the shoulder, into the scapula, onto the thorax, onto the rib cage. Now, bearing in mind at this position, we're only looking at this top segment. How the spine sits is relative to the pelvis, it's relative to the leg, it's relative to the foot. I've seen wrist pains that have been generated by poor foot mechanics as much as I've seen them generated by poor neck or shoulder mechanics. Into address position for me. Today we're going to look at particularly top of the thorax is interaction with the shoulder blade. If we have a compression around the top of the thorax, we have an area of the thorax that isn't liking to move well enough. Address again. Then we get a squash of the rib cage. We get a very slight look of kyphosis through the upper thorax. Then Mark's going to go into his backswing. And already he's having to start to adapt to move the arms in a different way to how he would like, because I'm not letting him move through the thorax. Relax back down. If I let go of that and actually I encourage good movement through the thorax and I open the whole area up, Mark's rotation changes, his movement changes, his backswing changes. And what will happen through the wrist is he doesn't have to do so much work through the arm to get into a good position. He can move fluently through the upper body, which means the arm can then follow and go along the right dynamics of that system moving into backswing position. The same, of course, happens as we come down to impact. If we have this compression, I've got half swing, Mark, for me, lovely, and then I say, right, Mark, now come down and get the club head to the ball, the chances of Mark moving nicely through the arm, through the upper body, and therefore through the arm and wrist is pretty low. He's going to have to work out how to get club head to ball. Thank you very much. How to get club head to ball without having this fluency of rotation through the upper thorax, through the spine. If we once again change, and now I'm going to help the spine move. So, hang on a second, too keen. Here we go, opening up through there, good, and then coming down to impact. We have a much more fluent movement through the upper body. We have the ability to rotate, and it's an easy movement. So it's not the fact the movement can't occur, it's just easier as I'm facilitating and helping that spine to move. So this is just one section of the body that would have a direct effect on the wrist. But when we look at that section, it's part of the rib cage. The rib cage goes all the way through the thorax. It's affected by the neck. It's affected by the diaphragm. It's affected by pelvic position. which in turn can be affected by knee, foot, ankle, etc. So poor old wrist gets such a bad rap. Right? Through it comes, and people, a ball strike or through swing, complain of the pain in the wrist, and believe me, they'll get an MRI and there'll be some kind of inflammation around the area, but to wrap it up and strengthen it up and send them back out again is missing the point of why that wrist pain is occurring. So as we look further afield, shoulder, scapula, upper thorax, mid-thorax, lower thorax, spine, head, pelvis, you have to incorporate all of these points when looking at wrist pain. Otherwise, you're putting a sticky plaster over a problem rather than actually getting to the root of why you're having to do these adaptive movements at the wrist in order to get the shot that you're looking for.
And I think kind of two add-ons that really Dave kind of almost touched upon there. MRIs are great. In essence, they show a real still picture in time. It gives you that kind of frame in time of, for example, how that wrist perhaps is kind of almost the structure, the tissues, the joint around that wrist in that picture. What it doesn't show you is actually how the wrist is moving through swing. So for sure, there may be some kind of localized information or kind of structural kind of damage. We use that in a very kind of crude way. But what it doesn't show is often with guys that get no issue or nothing been displayed for MRI, the risk is still be problematic because of what range is having to go through. So perhaps if you can even then show Dave, certainly show those real-time values on screen, you've really compressed my ribcage and thorax at address now. So come back into that start position, really kind of compress that thorax at address. If I go back to my kind of shaft parallel position, you'll see, for example, the range is now produced through radial deviation and extension through that trail wrist compared to how much rotation I have now through that thorax. If Dave now puts you in a much more expanded, much more open thorax position, as I now move back to halfway back, again, there's much less activity through the extension and radial deviations through that trail wrist, and also much more active rotation through that thorax. So really, certainly when Dave and I look at wrist pain, for sure, wrist can be one of the more problematic, more recurrent areas of pain in SWE, but the wrist is rarely the issue. So if you've experienced pain, or certainly kind of work in pre or post pain, pre-pain obviously being a pain avoidance, we can really look to explore that often what we see at the wrist is simply a response to how other segments really moving elsewhere.